We are nearing that point. In a way, it's very thrilling to realize that next week we are 500 years from the event. We've been talking about it, but we actually crossed that threshold. We begin the next 500 years.
Half a millennial.
None of us will be able to find out, but anyway, let's pray. Father, thank you for the day, for the beauty of the day, for bringing us together. Thank you for being able to open this door into the past and to understand a little bit better about how you worked with Martin Luther and the others to bring about for millions and millions and millions of people an entrance through the gates of paradise so that we can sing a song like this and know that our salvation is secured at the cross. We thank you and praise you. Pray you'll be with us today. In Christ's name we pray. Well, some of you have pointed out that we end our classes on cliffhangers. I guess kind of like, if you remember old enough as I am to remember the serial movies you used to go to, and sometimes television programs the same thing, where they leave you on the edge, and you say, don't stop there. Well, there's still TV dramas that do that. Don't stop there, keep going. Well, yeah, it's exciting. The things that happened to Luther were very exciting, and we are particularly blessed because he left us such a good record. As I said the other day, we don't know that much about the other reformers, certainly not about Calvin, who was very quiet about his personal life, and other reformers. But Luther tells you everything. So, it was a Diet of Arms in 1521, and the decision of the Diet of Arms was, of course, that Luther's a heretic. He stood before the emperor in that court, and he said, I will not recant. God help me, I will not recant. And so after the meeting was over there in Worms in the bishop's hall, the emperor said, I'm going to give him 21 days to surrender. And if he doesn't in 21 days, he's declared outlaw. He is no longer protected by law. Anybody can kill him, take him, arrest him, do anything they want with him with impunity. Now you might say, that sounds a little strange that the emperor would announce 21 days. But remember this, there were the multitude of crowds, people gathered in Worms. They hailed Luther as a hero when he came into the city. And they're all outside waiting. Had the emperor arrested him and that news been broadcast outside, you know what would have happened. Major riot. It would have been a difficult thing. They would have gone after the emperor. It's doubtful even his imperial guard could have protected him. There would have been an insurrection of major proportions because Luther was so popular. So 21 days, well, okay. Crowd dispersed, crowd dispersed. Now you can only guess what the emperor was up to then. When Luther left Worms, you can imagine that the emperor would have had him arrested and would have put him to death. Frederick was no dummy. Frederick knew exactly what his emperor had in mind. So Frederick called his men aside secretly, and he said, I want you to kidnap him. And I want you to take him to one of my castles, but don't tell me which one. Frederick had several. Don't tell me which one. Because then if the emperor asks me if I know where Luther is, I can truthfully say, no, I don't. So, in order to protect Luther, and in order to avoid riots, which Frederick didn't want, he had this little arrangement. So Luther starts out in his wagon, and all of a sudden all these men ride up. Are you Martin Luther? Yes, I'm Martin Luther. Actually, it's thought that one of his colleagues said, no, I'm Luther. And no, I am. Because they assumed it was the emperor. And they put a hood over his head so he couldn't see where he was going. And took him off in their own wagon and took him to the Wartburg castle near Eisenach. And there, it took the hood off of him, and he realized where he was. He was quite confused. And the point was, he was in protective custody. The emperor couldn't get him there. Now, he had to take a disguise, lest somebody see him, some spies see him, and tell the emperor, well, the Luther is at the Wartburg. So he grew a beard, discarded all his clerical garments, and took the name Joker Georg, Knight George. So he's Knight George. And so there he is in the Wartburg. Now Luther is not one to be idle. And it didn't take him long to decide this is a time for productive activity. I'm out of circulation. I'm not able to preach and be with people. So he decided, I'm going to translate the Bible into the vernacular, into German. Now he had access, of course, to the Greek text of Erasmus, produced in 1516. So using that and his knowledge of Hebrew, which came more difficult than the Greek, it is said it was just 12 days that he did the New Testament. But that seems incredible. But he very quickly produced the New Testament, then the Old Testament. There's a story, I don't know whether it's true or not, but a young boy who was kind of serving there in the castle, Luther called him aside. He said, young man, can you read this? And he showed him the traditional Vulgate, the Latin. And he said, no, sir, Dr. Luther, I can't read Latin. And he said, well, can you read this? And he put in his face, well, some of his translation from, I think it was one of the Psalms. And the boy said, oh, yes, sir, I can read it. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And it hit him, what I've done. And he said, see, our German larks can sing as sweetly as those Latin nightingales. Maybe the other way around with birds. But anyway, the point is, we can do as well as they can in Latin. Because he wanted everybody to have access to the Bible. And he translated that Bible in a way, it's almost a sense for sense. It isn't a bad translation. But a translator, anybody who's translated from one language to another knows you can produce a very wooden, stilted translation, and it's not easy to read. For instance, the Old American Standard in English, very stilted. But if you put it in more colloquial terms and sometimes use some extra words, you can make it to where it reads easier. So that's what he did. And that German translation of Luther was the official translation until recently, the only one that the people had. So he's there in the Wartburg. Meanwhile, back home, as they might say, in Wittenberg, Luther is gone. And that left his colleagues, Karlstadt and Melanchthon, in charge. Karlstadt, remember, is impetuous. He's older. He doesn't know how to lead people. Melanchthon is a scholarly type. He's a former humanist, and he's not a leader either. So neither one of them is capable of leading. But Karlstadt takes over. I'm the leader now. And I'm going to, Luther started a movement, but he didn't take it far enough. And I'll take it the rest of the way. So Karlstadt decides we've got to get rid of anything and everything that smacks of Catholicism. And he begins to lead riots into the churches. They throw rocks through the stained glass windows. They overturn the statues of Mary and the saints and all the other statuary in the churches. They take down the crucifixes. They do all kinds of damage to the churches. Karlstadt takes off all his clerical garments. I'm Brother Andreas. So it becomes really a riot. Crowds are out of control. The people don't know what to think. And Frederick is heartbroken as he sees his beautiful city that he wanted to be the the German Rome, and he sees it being destroyed by Karlstadt and his people. Now, the sources differ on this to whether actually Frederick asked for Luther to be brought back, or whether his assistant, his secretary, Spalatin, actually just took it upon himself. But at any rate, Spalatin came to the Wartburg and told Luther it's time to go back. So Luther went back to the Wittenberg, and he enters the city and takes control instantly. And you don't want to get Luther angry. Luther confronts Karlstadt. Karlstadt, you have turned this into a riot. This is disgraceful. You've laid hands on the crucifix. You have destroyed things. You cause people to hate each other. This is not Christ. This is not right. Get out of my face. I don't want to ever see you again. Well, actually, he did see him a few years, because Karlstadt came to Wittenberg begging to be taken in. But at any rate, Karlstadt goes off, and he becomes an Anabaptist, and that's another story. The Anabaptists are the Radical Reformation. Now, there's order restored in Wittenberg. And that was 1522, 1523. And Luther is back, preaching again, doing what he loves to do in Wittenberg. And then we progress toward 1525. And in 1525, there are some things that happen that we need to notice. There are actually some problems in 1525. As well as a good thing. There are three things in 1525 that we want to notice. If the clock doesn't get the best of us here. First of all, when Luther first began to teach what he did, the great Erasmus supported him, because Erasmus very much opposed the abuses of the Roman Church. And no one could be more satirical, sarcastic, caustic in attacks upon abuses in the Roman Church than Erasmus could. But Erasmus began to sense Luther is going, from his point of view, too far. You see, obviously, if you believe that you're justified by faith and not by your own works, you have to say, where does that faith come from? And Luther looked at Scripture. There are plenty of Scriptures that indicate that faith is a gift from God. And if it's a gift from God, upon what basis does God give it? Upon the basis of earned merit? No, because that would be work, wouldn't it? So, of course, it has to go back to the counsels of God in eternity. Thus, the doctrine of predestination. You are led logically to the doctrine of predestination if you understand that faith is a gift and works are not a part of your salvation. So Erasmus began to sense he believes in predestination, and he wanted to smoke him out. Now, as I said, at first, Erasmus supported him. He said, if they silence him, there'll be no end to their arrogance. And one time somebody said, what about Dr. Luther? What's he done that's wrong? And Erasmus said, oh, he's attacked the crown of the Pope and the bellies of the monks. That's two egregious sins, you know. And he joked about it. But now Erasmus is a little bit concerned. So he comes out in 1524 with a little book called Diatribe on Free Will. And in that he says, we are saved by grace mostly, but not entirely by grace. Largely by grace. He did say a work cannot be started or finished apart from God's grace, but man has free will, and that is the ability to pursue the things that lead to salvation or to turn therefrom. That's in the Diatribe. And he publishes it, and Luther doesn't react until the next year. The next year, Luther published his own work entitled On the Bondage of the Will. Now, if you thought and you know, a lot of people out there think predestination equals John Calvin, don't they? John Calvin invented the doctrine of predestination. Of course, that's false. I'm just saying that's what people think. Calvin was not so complete and not so thorough in his dealing with predestination as was Martin Luther. That is the ultimate thing to read on predestination. Now, having said that, let me back up just a moment to point out the Roman Catholic Church officially teaches that predestination is true. That is taught by Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologia. I read that part with great interest, where he examines the different arguments, pro, con, and he says, here's what I think, here's my conclusion that predestination is true, and what's my reason for it? Because St. Paul teaches it. It's there, but it wasn't soft pedal. And that's kind of where Erasmus wants to leave it. Soft pedal it. Don't bring it to the foreground. So Luther publishes his Bondage of the Will, and he says, I think you probably thought I was going to just forget about answering you, Erasmus. But that's not true. I've been thinking about this. You said it's a small matter that needs to be soft pedaled. But what you call a small matter, I say, is the hinge on which everything turns. And he proceeded to discuss the doctrine very forthrightly. You can't miss the point if you read that. You should get a copy of that and read it. You don't have it. Very much worth reading. On the Bondage of the Will. I'm sure Ken would sell you a copy of Logos. And in the process, he isn't very polite in how he addresses Erasmus. He's an Erasmian. He's a babbler. He's an Epicurean hog. Of course, he's Erasmus. He's Erasmus. But he makes some interesting comments about Erasmus. So that meant there's a break with Erasmus. There's a break with the humanists. That means that this ground that Erasmus occupies is fast disappearing. Erasmus occupied a middle ground between the two. And there were those who really worked on Erasmus to get him to take a stand. One of his good friends was Martin Van Dorp. Martin Van Dorp was a solid supporter of the Pope, and he said to Erasmus, you need to come out and firmly take your stand with His Holiness the Pope. And Erasmus said, I'd rather not. I want to be free to criticize him. Then there were those like Ulrich von Hutten who said to Erasmus, you need to come out and cast your vote with Luther. He said, a heretic to both camps. So he took that middle ground that was rapidly disappearing. It would be impossible to occupy shortly. Well, that happened. Luther never got over it. That was one of the things that continued to bother him, and he did have some depression as time went on. And he always thought when that happened that the devil was coming after him, and he had what he called attacks of anfechtung, which means opposition, and can mean all kinds of things. It's not clear in the German what anfechtung really means. But he once threw an inkwell at the devil. And you still see the ink on the wall. 1525, that happened. The break with Erasmus. 1525, something very unfortunate happened. And he never got over this. In fact, he blamed himself for it. It's called the Peasants' Revolt. Now, we had this revolt in Wittenberg led by Karlstadt. This is something separate. When you see the movies on Luther, they conflate the two. And I can understand if you're doing a Hollywood production, you're going to have just one incident like that. There were two. The thing in Wittenberg, and then this was in the south part of Germany, and it was worse. And I'm sure you're familiar with the feudal code. That's what saved Luther. Frederick was his lord. He owed him protection, and Luther owed him service. That's the lord-vassal relationship. There was also such a thing in the Middle Ages as manorialism. It's the same concept, but it's applied at the peasant level. Peasants lived on manors, and they served their lords of the manor. They were unfree. They were not slaves, but they were bound to the land by a contract, by an arrangement, and it's passed generation to generation to generation. And in Germany, it doesn't end until 1848. The lord owed the serf protection, health care, something enough to eat, a place to grow his own personal crops, freedoms. There were many things that he owed his serf, and the serf owed the lord work. It was very specific what he had to do. He had to work on the manor. Very much like slaves on plantations, but they're not slaves. They are unfree, but they're not slaves. What happened was the lords in South Germany were reneging on their contract. They were not providing the protection, and they were not providing the care that was due the serfs. And the serfs, some of them got together and sent a letter to Luther, because Luther had spoken of freedoms and blessings and privileges, and they please, Dr. Luther, speak to our lords and encourage them to do for us what they're supposed to do. And Luther did. He sent a letter to the lords and said, honor the contract. Do what you're supposed to do. What is honorable before God is for you to take care of your serfs. And they ignored Luther. And when they ignored Luther, the serfs took matters in their own hands and started a rebellion, a revolt, and they started burning down the houses of the manor houses of the lords and putting them to death and all this terrible riot, insurrection throughout the south part of Germany, in Bayern, in Bavaria. And Luther then wrote to these serfs and said, this is wrong. Luther did not believe in violence. He did not ever believe in that, in war or things like that. He said, no, this is not right for you to take up the sword and go after these lords. This is wrong. You are thieving, murderous hordes of peasants. You know, when he gets angry, that's the kind of language you can expect. Well, before the letter arrived in South Germany, the Protestants and Catholics together came together and put this riot down with brutal force, so that approximately 100,000 Germans died. That's horrible. And Luther's letter arrived after the fact, so that the survivors read it. And they saw how Luther had called them thieving, murderous hordes of peasants. And that's the reason today that South Germany is Catholic. They went back to the Catholic fold, and they have stayed there ever since, because they were Lutheran before. Now, Luther never got over that because he blamed himself for it. I don't know whether he should blame himself for it, but at any rate, it's a terrible, terrible thing. Do you have any questions to this point? We've got a few more minutes, and I'm going to go ahead a little bit. There's one more thing we got to talk about, 1525. You can think about your questions. This is a good thing. All right. Luther got married. And for him it was a good thing. Because to this point, anybody who had taken a vow as monk, as nun, as priest, they could not marry. They were to be celibate. And Luther began to write on this subject. And it began to be circulated. Meanwhile, there was a girl at the age of 6. She was sent by her father. He actually took her to a convent at Bremen. It was a Benedictine convent, and it was a good one, and put her there. And the reason he did, we know very little about this, but the reason we think he did is he had 10 children, and for each of these girls he has to provide a dowry, and a dowry is expensive. So it is less expensive to pay the fees to a convent than it is to pay the dowry. And he probably was a financial matter. And this little 6-year-old girl is left at this convent in Guayna, this Benedictine convent. So this is what she knows for several years. And then her father comes back a few years later when she's 10 and takes her to Nashville to a Cistercian convent. No one knows exactly why, except maybe the Cistercian fees were less than the Benedictine. I understand the Benedictine monasteries, convents were just wonderful. For instance, Teresa of Avila, the Spanish nun, she had an apartment. It was just gorgeous, apparently, in Spain. Anyway, she goes to Nashville to this Cistercian convent and lives there. That's all the life she's known. And as far as she knows, she'll stay there the rest of her life. But somehow the news gets back about Luther. And 10 of these girls, nuns, actually by this time, in this convent decide to make a break for it. And there is a merchant who delivers goods to the convent, and they get him on their side, and they persuade him to let them ride in his wagon. Now, he delivers goods. There's a theory that they got into the barrels, the empty barrels. I don't know whether they did or not, but these girls got in this wagon, and they went to Wittenberg because they heard of Dr. Luther. So all of a sudden, the wagon's offloaded, opened up, and out stepped these 10 ragged girls, young ladies, they're in their early 20s, that had escaped from the convent. And they're looking for Luther. And of course, Luther has a problem on his hands. What's he going to do with them? The only thing you can do with a runaway nun is to find a husband for her. So Dr. Luther has this problem on his hands. And evidently, this little girl, whose name is Catherine von Bora, she's from a noble family, but a poor family, obviously. So Catherine seems to work with Dr. Luther in finding husbands for all these girls, these young ladies, they're not girls now, they're in their 20s. All of them except Katharina. And she's pretty picky. She has a certain person in mind who's not interested in her, and the ones that Luther has picked out for her, she doesn't care for. So it's not working out, and finally, she looks at him, and he's saying, no. And they get married. Catherine and Martin get married. And they have a small wedding, and he never thought about marrying. Well, neither has she. They never thought about it. It worked out very, very well. He never thought about intimate relations with a woman, okay? He said, I did not lust after her. I'll tell you why I got married. To spite the devil, to provide an heir for my father, who was very angry with me for joining the monastery and not getting married and giving him an heir, and to leave something of me after they martyr me, after they kill me, because he thought he'd be killed. So those are very practical reasons. They're not personal reasons. He hadn't even thought about it.
I bet he had.
You bet he had. Well, he might have, Jerry. But as far as applying to him, okay. On their wedding night, Luther, now she'd been staying in the meantime with a noble family, and very nice accommodations. The monastery, the Black Cloister, where at Wittenberg, where Luther lived, and it was given to him to live. There was only one other monk, an older monk in there at the time. It had gotten run down, completely run down, and bad shape. And Luther, he's a man, we men don't think about things like this. He hadn't fixed his bed for a long, long time. Back then, the bed was straw, stuffed with straw, and there was a sheet wrapped around it and tied around it. And he hadn't changed his straw in a long time. He just plopped down the bed. And it is said that when she joined him in the bed, that it just collapsed. And he really didn't, you know, this is unexpected. This is new. Okay, he found out he really liked this. He really did enjoy being married. That part of it, if you please. They had 6 children, one after the other.
He figured it out.
He figured it out, didn't he? So he loved her. He really loved her. They had a good. Now they're 2 strong-willed people, if you please, very strong-willed. She took over and cleaned up that monastery. She went out and got the whitewash and painted it and fixed it up. She fixed the garden. She started growing vegetables. She took care of, raised animals. I mean, this is a tough woman. And Luther's a tough guy. And you would think they would have arguments. And sometimes when his friends were there and he had a little too much beer, he got to making some comments about her. But then you read some of the things he said about his wife. The most beautiful things he said about my Katie. He called her Sir Katie, sometimes Lord Katie. He worshipped her. Well, I don't think in a bad sense, but you know, he really thought he adored her. He adored her. And she him. And they had a wonderful, wonderful marriage. They had 6 children. 2 of them died. That happened a lot back then. And when Magdalena died, his daughter, he never got over that. But, oh, how proud he was when he was a father and little Hans was born. So I think our time is up. So we will meet next week in the gym. So all of you find your way there. And it'll be the last class in our celebration of the Reformation. Father, thank you. Again, we praise you, and we pray you'll be with us as we worship today, as we give you worship in spirit and in truth. You're a glorious God, a merciful God. We thank you for the salvation that you have wrought for us in Christ. We pray in his name.